everyone. My name is Monica Ward. I'm the Nonprofit Initiatives Manager at the Social Impact Exchange. Thank you for joining today's webinar discussion on evaluation, what an organization needs to scale for impact. Before I introduce our panelists, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. Please type all of your questions in the question box in the lower right hand of your screen. We will be answering questions at the conclusion of the presentation. If we're unable to get to your questions, we'll do our best to follow up individually or post answers on our website. This webinar is being recorded, and an audio copy of the webinar will be available on our website, www.socialimpactexchange.org, under Announcements. I'm happy to be joined today by two speakers who have extensive experience with evaluation for scaling impact, academia, and on-the-ground implementation in the nonprofit sector. Fred Galloway is a professor and 2012-13 university professor at the School of Leadership and Education Sciences at the University of San Diego, and has extensive experience with developing, implementing, and reviewing outcome evaluations. Fred will discuss the S&I 100 evaluation rubric and the methodological considerations prior to commissioning a study. Marcia Kurz is the president of the OASIS Institute and will provide a real-world example of her organization's focus on evaluation and how evaluation one last housekeeping item. If anyone could mute their lines that have background noise, we'd appreciate it. So going over today's agenda, again, we will be reviewing why evaluation is important to scaling. We also review the S&I 100 evaluation rubric, the importance of maintaining fidelity to core program elements, and then ultimately leave about 25 minutes for our question and answer session. So why is evaluation important to scaling? There's probably three key areas that the Social Impact Exchange in particular thinks about when thinking about evaluation and its importance to scaling. First, it documents impact. Is what you're scaling working, and is it working in a meaningful way? It also allows for continuous quality improvement and increased effectiveness of your program model, and allows you to fine-tune your program model for your greatest impact. And then three, it makes the case to funders. Your impact will open up new funding opportunities to scale your work. But perhaps most importantly and most significantly is that these effective solutions will ultimately reach more people. So we're going to use some time to talk about the S&I 100 evaluation rubric, but we also want to use this time to talk about the methodologies of the different evaluation types in this rubric, so that folks who are interested in pursuing evaluations have a good sense of what they should be looking for prior to commissioning one. The type of evaluation an organization pursues is determined by a variety of factors: resource constraints, funder requirements, stakeholder priorities, and sometimes competing priorities, commitment to learning, etc. We believe that the evaluation plays at least two very important roles. One is to document the results of a program or intervention. Another is to gain insights into what influences quality so that resources can be allocated as effectively as possible. The S&I 100 evaluation rubric sets uniform standards for the evaluations we accept, while recognizing that a lot of different factors go into the type of an evaluation an organization commissions. So our key areas of the rubric require that the evaluation be conducted by a third party, that it have quantitative outcomes, and then obviously have evidence of impact. Fred Galloway will now speak to the different type of evaluations the S&I 100 entertains in its application process and the methodological considerations organizations should have when commissioning an evaluation. Fred?
All right, thanks, Monica. As you can see, I'll be discussing the scoring rubric that my colleague, Robert Donmoyer, and I have been using to rate the quality of the evaluations conducted and then supplied to the Social Impact Exchange in support of your organizations. However, before discussing the methodological differences in the four types of evaluations, I wanted to add that in addition to the type of evaluation, we also pay close attention to such things as whether or not the evaluation used a strong, diverse sample size, the extent to which program dropouts and what we call selection bias were accounted for, the size and consistency of the outcomes or impact across program sites, how long ago the study was conducted, and the extent to which the results have held up over time. In fact, I'll discuss some of these issues in more detail in just a minute, but first wanted to share with you that, at least in my opinion, we're living right now in a golden age, true golden age of evaluation, where not only have the analytical and methodological tools available to us improved significantly, but even more importantly, the focus of our evaluative work has moved from mere program compliance to actually assessing the impact of our work. And let me give you an example to illustrate what I mean. Right here in San Diego, in the late 1980s, we had one of the first needle exchange programs in the United States designed to reduce the transmission of HIV. And at the time, the program was deemed successful from an evaluation standpoint because almost 100,000 dirty needles were exchanged for clean ones. However, 10 years later, when another needle exchange program was conducted, merely exchanging the needles was not a sufficient criterion for evaluation. Instead, the evaluation focused on the outcome that really mattered, the extent to which the transmission of HIV had been reduced among drug users. Thankfully, this is now the evaluation world that we all live in, and candidly, we're all better off for having this higher bar set for our work. Now, having said this, let me turn to the four methodological types of evaluation that we consider, and you can see them on the screen, beginning with what many of us consider to be the gold standard, randomized control trials, which simply involve random assignment of individuals to control and treatment groups. Of course, these trials are exceptionally popular in the world of medicine, especially those involving drug trials, because when done correctly, they are the only true way to show that causality actually exists. In other words, the treatment received actually caused the individual to get better. However, I'm sure as many of you know, these trials are exceedingly difficult to implement in social behavioral studies with human subjects because assigning participants to a control group means potentially denying treatment or services to participants, where in many settings such denial of services would be clearly unethical or even illegal. Interestingly, from a historical perspective, the principles of randomization were first introduced by the great 20th century statistician Sir Ronald Fisher in 1935. Before then, the dominant practice was to control for covariates or confounding factors that might contaminate the treatment. However, Fisher's insight was that instead of trying to control for every potential confounding factor, he proposed to control for nothing, namely to employ a method of randomization. Now, kind of speaking of insights on a much smaller scale, I've written extensively on something that I call shades of causality, where I argue simply that the more randomized the true groups really are, the stronger the form of causality that emerges from the randomized control trial. A simple example I think will prove helpful. Suppose that 1,000 women are randomly sorted into control and treatment groups for a study on a new drug that is thought to reduce the incidence of breast cancer. Even though the process of randomization should, in theory, result in both groups being equal in terms of the average age of the women, their racial and ethnic composition, their family history of breast cancer, and other known predictors of breast cancer, suppose that in reality the groups actually turn out to be unbalanced on these items. If this occurs, then the resulting form of causality that emerges from the randomized control trial will simply not be as strong as if the groups had been truly balanced. And this is an important theme that underscores the three other types of evaluation that I'll now be discussing. For example, you'll see on our list that the next two types of evaluations are called quasi-experimental studies A and quasi-experimental study B. They simply refer to the extent that in the absence of randomization, evaluators are able to statistically control for differences between the treatment group and the comparison or control group. For example, we think of a quasi-experimental study A as a study where the comparison group is similar to the treatment group on all, or at least most of the variables that are anticipated to affect the performance on the outcome measures in the study. However, we define quasi-experimental study B as one in which the comparison group may be similar demographically to the group receiving treatment, but differs in terms of other characteristics like perhaps motivation, interest, and values. In fact, the recent popularity of a statistical technique called propensity scoring analysis has provided evaluators with a powerful method for doing just this. And the extent to which evaluators are successful at implementing this propensity scoring is at the heart of the differences that really exist between the two types of quasi-experimental studies. Now, to illustrate, let me provide an example to kind of describe what I mean. In the early 90s, you may recall, this is the time when educational vouchers were first introduced in the United States, and the two sites were Cleveland and Milwaukee. The early evaluators of educational vouchers, and everybody in the United States was interested in watching what the results of this evaluation were. Did educational vouchers really result in better educational outcomes? So what the evaluators did is they carefully matched participants in the voucher program to those in the school systems in terms of demographics and test scores. And they did a very careful matching to try and identify individuals by age, gender, racial and ethnic type, whether the kids were eligible for free and reduced lunch, and test scores. They did this incredibly close matching. However, they did not account for the differences that existed among the parents of the children, in that the parents that actually got their children in the program, they had to research the voucher program. They had to, they had to actually register for it. They had to enroll their children, and it was clear that these parents were different than the parents who didn't enroll their kids in the voucher programs. So it was quite interesting. The early evaluators, when they compared the results for the kids that got the vouchers to their matched set of kids in the schools, their findings turned out to be largely dismissed 10 years later by economists. The folks doing these original studies where they had the matched group of kids in the schools, this is what we would call a quasi-experimental study B. Yes, the individuals were similar on demographics and test scores, but they weren't similar in the motivation of the parents, right? So it was quite interesting years later, when the results of the earlier evaluations were largely discredited by a series of economists, evaluators decided to go at this a different way. They decided to form their control group from those children whose parents had applied for the lottery program but were lost out, applied for the voucher program but lost out in the lottery. This is an example of what we call a quasi-experimental study A, in which the control group was actually formed from the kids that applied for the program but didn't get in. That way, both groups were similar in terms of not only demographics, but parental interest and parental motivation. So you can see if you compare a quasi-experimental study A with a quasi-experimental study B, you can see why we score a quasi-experimental study A higher than the quasi-experimental study B, because it simply controls for more factors. Now, the final type of our evaluation on the list, the quantitative outcomes evaluation, this is where there's really no effort made at all to statistically show that the group that received the treatment and some control group are similar. And in fact, sometimes no control group exists at all. And this occurs more frequently than you might imagine. We see oftentimes in evaluations simply shows the gains made by participants with no real reference to control group. And of course, while it has some value, it fails to address the important question: compared to what? For example, a study that shows gains in maturity or academic reasoning over time as part of an intervention might also be occurring for individuals that didn't receive the treatment. As such, this type of evaluation receives our lowest score, despite the fact that the findings may appear to be significant to those delivering the intervention. So whenever and wherever possible, I'd encourage all of you thinking about designing a summative evaluation to pay attention closely to the statistical rigor of how you go about things. When we're talking about scalability, the statistical rigor is really important, and that's a real takeaway point I want to leave everyone with. And there's one other thing I'd like to say kind of in closing. Since ultimately the S&I 100 is all about being able to scale up an intervention, I strongly encourage all of you to stay away from formative evaluations, since by definition, these are evaluations that are about improving the processes involved in delivering the intervention. So I'd wait until you feel that your intervention is really in a steady state, where you have all the processes, smoothed out and everything's working, before moving forward with a summative evaluation. So I think that's a quick summary of these four. I think, Monica, I'll turn it back to you now.
Great. Thank you so much, Fred. A couple of things I just really like to emphasize from Fred's discussion is, again, the purpose of the S&I 100 rubric is the fact that we recognize that there has to be options in the field other than a randomized control trial when doing an evaluation, and that while RCTs are considered the gold standards, they're not necessarily the only option for effective evaluation. So hopefully, Fred's examples especially highlighted how other options can be equally as effective. And then also I'd like to emphasize the other point of having scalability in a steady state, and why for the SNI 100 and the application process through here, a formative evaluation are not appropriate for this work. While we also believe in the value and the importance of formative evaluations to help organizations fine-tune their models and make adjustments as needed, it's not what we can review in terms of evidence and outcomes and impact. So thank you, Fred, for highlighting those examples and hopefully putting some real-world examples in people's minds when they're thinking about what can be sometimes cumbersome methodological discussions. I'm not going to talk about, if I could, there we go, the importance of maintaining fidelity to core program elements. I think there's a good link here between fidelity to core program elements and exactly what Fred was talking about before in terms of linking your match control group in your evaluations. And that is the methodological importance in an evaluation, but then there's something that you even should think about when you're scaling your work. It's almost like the next step to making sure a future evaluation would be just as rigorous, and that's maintaining fidelity to the core program elements. There's three key reasons for this. Obviously, it's going to replicate your impact. So replication of your findings, and if your program elements are different, you should not or may not or cannot expect the same outcomes. It also will establish an evidence-based practice for future scale. So if you know if it's working and you know who it's working for, then you're going to be able to scale that in a rigorous yet rigorous way, but still being maintaining that fidelity. And similarly, it's understanding what works and for whom and under what circumstances, really understanding your target population. So taking the same model to different populations and understanding who it may or may not work for. Again, I'd like to emphasize here that this is the type of information, while RCTs do show the causal relationships, it's not the only way to learn about this causal relationship. So again, having an effective evaluation is the first step in really thinking about how you scale your work. The second step, though, is making sure that you maintain the fidelity of the core program elements that you evaluated. So now I want to turn the discussion over to Marcia Kurz from the OASIS Institute. And the OASIS is an organization that's been moving forward with evaluation for a while, but I think it's an organization that's been around for several decades, and it's a very interesting story for all organizations who are thinking about scale and evaluation and the difference between 20 years ago and today in thinking about how they relate to each other and how what worked 20 years ago doesn't necessarily work today. So, Marcia? Marcia? Okay, well, luckily I know OASIS's story, so I will give a quick highlight of what her experience has been with the evaluation. OASIS Institute provides the social and emotional learning aspect for seniors and really engaging seniors in different types of volunteer and educational opportunities throughout their life. And one of the things that, as you know, OASIS is one of the SNI 100 organizations, and she obviously, in order to make it onto the platform, had an evaluation and has a growth plan. But one of the things that Marcia was going to talk about was a program that they have for tutoring students, in which they engage seniors to do that. And this is a program of OASIS that has been around many years. And it's a program that there's not many like it throughout the country. They do have a few colleagues and or competitors. But what they realized is that this was a program, as they were being supported through philanthropic dollars. Their main source of philanthropic support was going away, and that they needed to really be able to attract new funding opportunities, be it through other philanthropy dollars as well as some earned income revenue, and how they were going to do that. Luckily, they had advance notice and they had years to plan for this work, and so they realized that one of the biggest things that was missing from this program, which they knew from anecdotally from the surveys that they did with their students as well as the seniors providing the tutoring, that it was an effective program and it was of value to the schools that were using it because they were continually coming back and signing up again every year. But they recognized that the survey of the tutors and the students weren't enough and that they needed to go after dollars to get a more rigorous evaluation to establish their evidence base. And so they went about and they were working to trying to get federal funding for their evaluation, and recognizing that they were going to different federal agencies, obviously the Department of Education and others, to really support this work, and they weren't able to get the funding that they needed to do the type of rigorous evaluation that they wanted. And one of the interesting things that Marcia and her team did is that they recognized that it would play such an important role in being able to sustain this program that with or without the money that they were going to have to move forward with commissioning this evaluation. So they're still in the process of finding some of the financial support to do that, but in the meantime, one of their strategies was then to look closer to home and to link up with one of the local universities to provide the evaluation support over the next several years to really assess the impact of this program. And again, we use this as an example because it was a program that had been around for a long time. It's a program that I think she said for about 24 years, and it was an effective program, and there was aspects of obviously the children getting a lot out of the tutoring, but equally so the seniors who were providing the tutoring. They recognized that in order to sustain this program and move it forward in the absence of the seed philanthropic dollars that they had to date, that they really were going to have to look and commission this evaluation. So hopefully I did that summary justice. I know Marcia probably is upset that she wasn't able to join today's call, but she will be blogging about this specific experience on the Social Impact Exchange website, and that should be up by the end of this week too, so you can hear more of her story there. So I'm going to stop now and see how we're doing with the questions and see if there's any other additional questions or insights either Fred and I can provide both on the SNI 100 process, evaluations in general, and what organizations who are interested in just conducting evaluations as well as having evaluations for the purpose of scaling, questions that we might be able to assist with. Okay, just a quick housekeeping question, two housekeeping questions. Yes, this session is being recorded and will be provided on the Social Impact Exchange's website. The two presenters, again, are Fred Galloway from the University of San Diego. Marcia Kurz was unable to join us today, but she'll have a blog up on our website speaking to her experience. But Fred, this is a question for you. There is a question about when is it helpful or useful to have a quasi-experimental study, and I'm assuming the question means in place of just a direct outcome, quantitative outcome study versus an RCT. What would be a benefit of a quasi-experimental over those two options?
Well, that's a great question, and I think, as I said in my presentation, oftentimes you can't conduct a randomized control trial because it's just impractical. It's either illegal, unethical, or you just can't pull it off. So the randomized control trials are actually require very unique situations to do. Having said that, the reason quasi-experimental studies are better than this kind of the third-party evaluation is, as I mentioned, third-party evaluations don't really have any comparison group. So you can't really tell how the people in the intervention have done really better than people not in the intervention. So the third-party ones are candidly the least expensive to do. A lot of times they can be done by people without any real statistical training. But if you really want to convince people that the intervention you're implementing really works, that is, that people who receive this treatment actually do better than people that don't receive the treatment, then you need some sort of comparison group. And again, the difference between the two types of quasi-experimental studies are really the degree to which you control, the degree to which you can show that the control and treatment groups are really similar, okay? The more outcomes, the more ways you can show they're similar, kind of the stronger the results that come from it. Now, the thing is, when I talked about this propensity scoring technique, it's a way to actually introduce kind of a form of causality, a more limited form of causality than you get from randomized control trials, but it's certainly better than nothing. And so, it's interesting as an academic, we publish journal articles all the time that are, widely read around the world. And the bar in publishing those things is you have to have some sort of control group. You have to be able to show that the people that you gave the intervention to did better than people that didn't get the intervention. And you really have to do that using some statistical techniques to do that. So we all recognize that randomized control trials, aren't for everyone. And, gosh, as an economist, I rarely get to be involved in randomized control trials. As a result, there's been so much work to try and strengthen what we call these quasi-experimental studies and to show that, geez, the treatment that you gave to a group of individuals, be them children or any other sort of group, you really need to show that, gosh, the people that got the treatment did better than people that didn't get the treatment. And again, the closer you can show that those two groups are in all the things that might matter, kind of the stronger the form of causality that comes from it. So I would encourage everyone that really wants to show that, hey, the work we're doing is making a difference. You have to answer the compared to what question. That's why I'm a big fan of quasi-experimental studies.
Great, thank you. Fred, this question is probably for both of us, but I'll let you kick it off. How would you suggest a small nonprofit with no in-house evaluation services being provided begin the process to institutionalize rigorous evaluation?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think one of the ways to do it, and of course in one respect you might have expected me to say this because I'm in an academic institution, but oftentimes, like we have a Castor Center here at the University of San Diego for nonprofit research, and oftentimes we do evaluations for groups at fairly low cost. In fact, I was involved in a pro bono evaluation for a phenomenal nonprofit called Turning the Heart Center. Have been arrested. Grant, money to do the evaluation they needed so that they could generate evidence that then they could take to big-time funders. And so we worked here at the Castor Center to do an evaluation. It was actually a pro bono evaluation, but I've worked on a number of evaluations where we do them at reduced cost. The university's overhead is not the same sort of overhead you'd have to pay in the for-profit world. I've also worked in the for-profit consulting world where I've done large-scale evaluations for the federal government. I've also done evaluations for large foundations, including Pew Charitable Trusts. Those things are very costly. But working with academic institutions might be a way to be able to really ratchet up the level of rigor of the work done at a much lower cost than going out and contracting with a regular private consulting firm. So that's certainly one suggestion. Monica, you have any other good ideas?
No, you took my suggestion.
That's what you get for letting me go first.
Yeah, but I would encourage you, not only speaking with local academic institutions, but also they have opportunities for just this type of back and forth discussion, whether they do their own presentations on evaluations, but there's lots of opportunities to learn from that field as to what can and make good evaluations and how nonprofits can really learn about what would make most sense for their organization.
Well, and if I could add one thing, Monica, I think that's important. Those of you thinking about designing an evaluation, saying, okay, we do need at least a semi-rigorous evaluation of the work we're doing. I urge you all to just to think before you get into the evaluation, what sort of group might you use as a comparison group? Okay? Oftentimes, let's say you're offering a particular intervention, and because of limited funding, you can afford to offer it to 100 kids. Let's say 200 kids would like it, but you can only afford to offer to 100. You might want to think about, hey, I maybe want to follow the 100 kids that wanted this but couldn't afford it. We couldn't afford to deliver it to them. You might want to think about trying to track their progress as well, because what really matters in the evaluation world is the design you use. And so if you can just, before you get involved in evaluation work, think about what sort of group could we compare, what sort of group could we use for comparison so that we can at least present some sort of evidence that the intervention we're using with this group of kids that we're able to afford giving the treatment to, here's a group of kids just like them that we can't afford doing. Maybe we should think about somehow following them as well. Design work like that will produce a much more powerful evaluation than the absence of something like that. And when you would then go to a university or even maybe to a private individual to help out, and you say, oh my gosh, you got this design just right. That makes my work a lot easier. So my advice is to really think before actually going and doing an evaluation, think about how you might design it in a way that you have a control group that is meaningful.
Great. Yeah, and I think that's one of the key things we hope folks take away from this discussion is what do you need before you even start? What should you be thinking about? One of our lessons learned is that, and it's not through inadequacies of evaluation firms or whatever, it's just, a study is designed one way, and it's not the study that's going to really show the impact for this organization. It doesn't mean it's a bad study, but it's just not really getting at the key outcomes and goals that an organization wants to achieve. And so rather than spending money on something that at the end of the day isn't going to be helpful, we really want folks to think about what they need well in advance of even speaking to a firm, a university or whomever about helping them with this work.
That's right. Just remember the compared to what. That
Yeah.
question's really critical.
Yeah. And related to that, one of the questions we have here is often RCTs and other evaluations take years to complete. What can organizations show in the short term to help with scaling? And do performance metrics matter since there's no comparison group? Fred, if you don't mind, I'll take the last piece of that and then let you dive into the other piece about RCTs. In terms of performance metrics and do they matter since there's no comparison group, they absolutely do matter because that's going to get at the type of things that really help you fine-tune those core program elements we were talking about and allow you to maintain fidelity to those core program elements, because it's getting the organization to think about what do we think is working? And here's some outcomes. Yes, there's no comparison group. That's really showing that a potential that this is the causal effect of our intervention. And if it's not having as great of an impact as we thought we might want to see, how do we change that? So I definitely think performance metrics matter. It helps you not only with, again, the program model, it also helps you assess, is it a program model that has to deal with staff capacity? Is it a training issue? It answers a lot of that, those questions that often get at an formative evaluation that are just as important to help you set the stage for a more rigorous study.
And Monica, I think you really teed me up by talking about the importance of performance metrics, because, if you're doing a longitudinal study, you're thinking, oh my gosh, this is, it's going to take 4 years before we show something. Well, I urge you to think of that in a different way. To think of short-term performance metrics, maybe medium-term, and then longer-run performance metrics. Yeah, we all know that, it's more powerful evidence if something sticks for 3 or 4 years. That's much more powerful than if it sticks for just a year or two. But when you design an evaluation, also think of short-term performance metrics, because then when the evaluation's going on, you don't have to wait till the end of 4 years. You can actually say, well, we're 1 year in. What's going on with our short-term performance metrics? And yes, they're not as powerful as the medium or longer-term ones, but they're showing something. So I would urge you not to be put off by doing something longitudinal. I just urge folks to think carefully about what short-term outcomes are important on the road to those longer-run outcomes.
I'm going to lump a couple of questions together because I think they're related, and that's regarding costs and timeline for conducting these different types of studies. Specifically, there was a question, and I'll as someone who is in the field much more than I, Fred, I'll let you kind of take first crack at this question as to what is the range of cost for various levels of studies, and especially, given that resource dollars to do these type of studies is often limited, if we have ideas for different avenues for research funding.
Yeah, that's a tough question because there's so much variability. Gosh, evaluations I've seen them done. Again, I've been involved in pro bono ones, or ones that, might cost as little as, maybe $20,000, $25,000. On the other hand, longer run evaluations with maybe lots of moving parts, with lots of different program sites and things, can cost a lot more. I mean, I ran an evaluation in the mid to late 1990s for the U.S. Department of Education, actually evaluated President Clinton's way of doing student loans, the direct loan program, which, by the way, is now the way all student loans are done. This was in the mid-90s. It was a 5-year evaluation, had five major components. This was a $7 million affair, okay? Evaluations they're all over the map in terms of what they cost. The one thing to think about, I mentioned this earlier, but is if you can be thoughtful in thinking right from the beginning when you're delivering the treatment to somebody, what might a good comparison group look like? And is there any way I can try and follow what's going on with that comparison group? That will make things so much simpler. It will really reduce the cost because you've got the design just right. So I would certainly encourage you to do that. As far as timeline, I'll go back to a comment I made in my opening remarks, and that is, don't jump the gun. If you're still in the formative stage and if you're still ironing your processes out, wait till you feel like, hey, okay, we've kind of got it now, okay? And then you can start thinking about the summative evaluation. I've seen people that try and do a summative evaluation when they're in the formative stage, and then it's kind of a waste, okay? Because whatever you find, the intervention's changed. So, don't jump the gun. If you're in the formative stage, stay there. As soon as you feel like you kind of got things figured out and the processes are kind of stable and you're in what I would call a steady state, then really start thinking about what sort of group can we use as a comparison group, and then see what you can afford. The thing is, I will tell you this, if you're interested in scaling, if you're interested in getting funding from big funders to continue your work, the rigor of the evaluation is important, and I'll just tell you, it's money really well spent because it has a potentially huge economic return.
Great, thank you. I actually think, Marcia, were you able to join us?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Oh, I have no idea what finally brought us in. I apologize.
That's okay. I'm thinking actually this next question, given that I hopefully did it somewhat justice. I know you could have done it more eloquently.
Actually, you did an excellent job.
Okay, well, thank you. But I think this next question could apply to your experience with the tutoring program and really the role of your organization's theory of change and what that role is in when you have outcome evaluations. And so, and specifically how to look at the outcomes that you propose in your theory of change and structuring an evaluation around that. If you could speak a little to your experience, especially with the tutoring program around that.
Well, in the tutoring program, of course, we started out with minimal survey evaluation, assuming that would be appropriate 24 years ago, and learned that the change we were seeing in the theory of change included students who were identified as being increasing in academic performance. The older adults were indicating in survey work that it added a positive element to their lives. And so all of the survey work we did was very, very strong. But moving forward in terms of outcomes, we had to look at the program differently to determine a more rigorous approach to the theory of change and outcomes. And so we are now, as you mentioned quite eloquently, Monica, we are in a research mode now in terms of actually looking at pre and post reading scores of children kindergarten through 4th grade who have been tutored with a control group of children kindergarten through 4th grade who have not been tutored. So, you know, as you move forward, you find that different requirements in terms of the change you are seeking require you to take on new and additional research.
Great, that's really helpful. You know, and I think to Marcia's point too, it's as you're growing, it's not just taking on new research to prove your existing program, but it's as your program grows, what additional research may be needed that wouldn't have been addressed otherwise. So again, sometimes as your growth strategies are slightly different than your original strategies, then your outcomes and therefore your evaluations should speak to that as well.
Right, and I should also say that one of the big changes also was the pressure on school districts to have strong outcomes now that they are looking so strongly at in-school time. And our program is an in-school time program, and so we have to be able to demonstrate that the children are improving their reading scores based on the demands from the school district and their boards of education.
Great. Another question, and it's related to probably the performance metric question, and maybe for Fred. You know, we talk about evaluation for results and outcomes, but then there's evaluation for learning. And again, that would go into the, I think, the performance question a little bit before. Can we think of these as compatible? And then, you know, where would they be different?
Well, I think we can think of them as compatible because, I mean, learning goes on in not only formative evaluations where we're learning how we might better improve the processes we're using to deliver the intervention, but learning also goes on in summative evaluations because we're getting a chance through the use of performance metrics to see the extent to which the work we're doing is making a difference. And so, you know, I think that there's learning involved in both sorts of evaluations. They're completely compatible. They're just different sorts of learning. In the formative evaluation, it's learning about how we can better deliver what we're delivering. And then in the summative, it's like, okay, now we're delivering this intervention in the best way we can. Is it making a difference in the lives of the people we're delivering the services to? So I see them as totally compatible. It's just best to figure out how to deliver the intervention, you know, in kind of the smoothest way possible. Then before you say, hey, okay, now that we figured out how to deliver it, is it making a difference? So I see them compatible and learning occurring in both sorts of evaluations.
Great. Another interesting question, and this is kind of about the cost benefit or you know, cost analysis associated with interventions, and how important is it to include the cost of the intervention in the evaluation and what should be included. Before I hand that over to Fred, I would say that, listen, if you have the ability to track that, I would always encourage it, but I wouldn't encourage it as the first step in your evaluation if you haven't done evaluation before. You know, I think it would be either if you're commissioning a RCT, perhaps that could be included in the discussion. But for organizations that are kind of in the early stages of evaluation, you know, costs, while it might be easy to capture the cost of the program, the benefit to the people you're serving in terms of, you know, savings or systems that you're working with might be harder to get at right away. And I think it would be more prudent and effective to focus on the model first, and then the cost aspects of the model in subsequent evaluations or addendums to evaluations. Fred, I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you said, Monica. Really don't have much to add, but do understand when you have an intervention in a steady state, and you have a sense of how much, for example, it costs to deliver per individual. Do understand that if the intervention gets scaled, that there are oftentimes a appropriately named, what economists like to say, are economies of scale. That is, scalability can oftentimes lower the average cost of delivering the intervention. So I think the first thing to do is to figure out how to deliver the intervention appropriately. And of course, it's nice to document the cost of that, but you know, the cost per service delivered or per individual treated could decrease as the intervention is scaled up. So I mean, I think it's important to do that, but it's just more important to figure out how to deliver the intervention appropriately.
Mm-hmm.
Next question is, can we recommend some strategies for using evaluation results and findings for informing program improvements? Or how should program staff look at and use evaluation results? You know, Fred, maybe perhaps you can talk to the, you know, some of the strategies, but Marcia, also after Fred gives some examples, maybe you can talk about how you have used it in OASIS's work, maybe even beyond the tutoring program, to fine-tune your program model. So I'll turn it to Fred first, and then maybe Marcia, if you could add your thoughts.
Yeah, and I'll just add a couple words to say. I mean, if I understand the question, it's about how, and let me make sure I understand the question. Is it really about how evidence can be brought to bear on improving what you're doing, or maybe I'm misunderstanding that? Monica, would you mind restating the question for me?
Sure. Can we recommend strategies for using evaluation results and findings to inform program improvements?
Okay, well, that's kind of I think that's really getting at what a formative evaluation is,
right?
And that is that in a formative evaluation, you're interested in finding ways in which you can improve the processes you're delivering. Now, if you're interested in strategies to try and get at that information, one possible way to do it is if you think, gosh, you know, there are a couple different ways we could deliver this service. For example, we could deliver it all in-house. We could take it to, you know, to different geographical locations. Well, you can try that kind of there's a strategy to see, you know, how is this best delivered. Perhaps another strategy might be, how could this be delivered technologically, okay? Does this have to be delivered in person? Could this be delivered online? Could it be delivered as a combination, kind of a hybrid of the two? I think that you can do some experimentation in the processes you used to deliver services, and you know, so I guess you can call those strategies to see, gee, which of these ways seems to work best. So I think, you know, I view that as part of all process evaluation. But I think if you think there are a couple ways of doing something and you're really not sure which way you think is best, why not experiment and try the different ways? I mean, that's kind of doing a little junior randomized control trial within your own shop. But there's nothing wrong with that. So, I mean, just be open to different ways of doing things. And if you're not sure, feel free to try different things.
Great. And I think that before I turn to you, Marcia, for maybe a real-world example, that's related to another question that came down the pipe in terms of, you know, for small, again, the small nonprofit that doesn't necessarily have these services in-house, how to think about the process for institutionalizing rigorous evaluation as a core component of their programming. It's related to both this last question in terms of, you know, the end product is using the evaluation and the findings to help inform your work and change your work. But, you know, it's, I think, a comment that Fred had made in the very beginning. Just start with what you have and start, you know, with collecting data that you can collect as a way to establish a foundation and a quality improvement data collection effort, too, to really start laying that foundation for more rigorous evaluation in the future.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing real fast. It's really a mindset. It's really a mindset. If you know you're doing this work because it's important, something needs to be done, individuals need to be helped, and so the mindset is to think we're doing something we think is going to be pretty cool, it's going to work. Again, you have to think, what does it mean to work? You know, compared to what? So it's more of a mindset to really get your head around what you're doing and how can we show that we're really making a difference compared to people that aren't getting this. Just that mindset really sets you up down the line for a more rigorous evaluation work.
Great. And Marcia, can you talk about maybe some of your experience at OASIS in terms of taking your evaluation results and findings, whether it's been your internal evaluation or external evaluations, and how that's helped in work?
Yes, in our intergenerational physical activity and nutrition program, in a 2-year pilot, we completed both a process evaluation and a quantitative evaluation on the outcomes for both children and older adults. And we learned an incredible amount in the process evaluation on changes that we needed to make in the program in order to improve its effectiveness. From items such as volunteers in the program needed a higher level of training. We needed other volunteers to do behind-the-scenes work at the after-school programs, that the exercises that children and older adults were involved in weren't quite appropriate, so we had to reselect. So it really allowed us in a 2-year pilot to make dramatic changes to the program that then impacted our quantitative outcomes in year 3 and 4 quite significantly.
Great. And I think we have about 5 more minutes, so I'm going to wrap up with this last question that I'll speak to from the SNI 100 perspective and the social impact exchange in general, and then again, maybe Marcia, you can talk a little bit more about what was necessary for OASIS to have in terms of, it's really an organizational strength and capacity question, and it's, the question is, it seems that to adequately scale up, practices related to organizational capacity would need to be evaluated. What efforts do we see around understanding not just the direct intervention itself, but also the broader organizational conditions that ensure delivery of these interventions? I think this is a great question, and it's an entire section on which, in the SNI 100 application, organizations get assessed on. And so it's assessed in, pretty much 4 broad areas of, management, what your board of directors looks like in terms of your governance policies, and then your just general operations. And while I think even a small mom-and-pop nonprofit organization can still do really good evaluations, yes, there is some strength in the ability to have some sort of knowledge management tool and IT functionings and data systems to collect information on an ongoing basis, and to have management that, is supportive of that work and actually prioritizes that work, and really has the depth to understand what is needed in terms of collecting useful information that will help you move your organization forward. And that also includes a supportive board of directors that are actively involved, and, what type of expertise they have in helping both with the evaluation component as well as just overall scale. So, Marcia, I don't know if you could talk a little bit quickly about what OASIS, the strengths of OASIS that made some of your work possible.
Certainly, capacity is a huge issue. OASIS is a fairly small organization in terms of staff. One of the steps we took early on, over 10 years ago, was to actually bring the board and the leadership staff together to determine that we would look at evidence-based programs and initiatives and move toward evidence-based work in whatever capacity we could. It gave us at least the direction that this is where we wanted to go, and it has guided us over the last 10-plus years. We've also, and I know Fred and Monica, you mentioned this earlier, we've created wonderful partnerships with universities. We've used graduate students. Our partnership with Washington University here in St. Louis has allowed us to use graduate students in a number of ways that can help significantly on building capacity. So I think those are the primary ways. But I think the most effective step we took was to create a policy that was adopted by the board that we will move towards evidence-based work.
Could I comment on, Marcia, you made an incredibly important point, and I really wanted to underscore it. Oftentimes if you're a small organization and you really can't afford to do the sort of evaluation work you'd like, what you might be able to do is this. You might be able to offer an internship to a graduate student, just like Marcia's describing, at a local university, somebody who understands evaluation, who has an understanding of statistics, and they might, Some internships you can get away with non-paid internships, but even you have to pay a very modest amount. I mean, you're buying the services of a soon-to-be professional, either professional evaluator or somebody who uses statistics in their life. So I think that's just an incredibly important suggestion you made, Marcia, and I really wanted to underscore it. That's, I think, the way out for small organizations. Partner with a local university and see if you can offer internships or an internship to a graduate student in this area, and you're gonna get talk about bang for your buck. So that's an outstanding suggestion, Marcia.
Well, great. It is 2:59, so we only had an hour for this discussion, but I want to thank both of our presenters, Fred Galloway and Marcia Kurz, for really a very thoughtful discussion. And again, I think we got to most of the questions posed to us, but please feel free to reach out to us with any additional questions that you may have. I can be reached at mward@growthphilanthropy.org. And in the meantime, as I had mentioned, this webinar is recorded and will be up on our website in the next couple of days, as well as Marcia's blog on her experience with the tutoring program. So I encourage folks to check out those resources as well. But thank you so much again, and we look forward to doing another webinar in the future.